Hello and welcome again to our study in the series of Daniel. So far we've gone through Daniel's chapters 1 through 5, and now we're in Daniel chapter 6, a familiar story, Daniel in the lion's den. And this week we'll be going from Daniel 6, 7, 8, and 9. At the same time we'll be dealing with, in another video series, in the life of Jesus his last week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday before his crucifixion and ultimate resurrection. And there's some parallels we can draw from the books of Daniel, the chapters of Daniel 6, 7, 8, 9, with this week, some prophecies that we're going to see unfold that help us understand how they apply to Jesus, as well as just understanding God's plan for the nations. But here we've got Daniel chapter 6, and we find ourselves coming right on the heels of Daniel chapter 5 that we had last week. And specifically what I want to explain is that the year is around 537 BC. Daniel has been in Babylon now, probably a little bit less than 70 years. 537, he was taken captive 605, and so he's about 68 to 70 years in Babylon captive, according to the chronology of the captivity here. And so Israel is still captive in Babylon, but there's been a change in government. We learned last week in Daniel chapter 5 that basically in chapter 5 verse 30, when Daniel explained the prophecy about the destruction of Babylon, that same night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was slain. And so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at the age of about 62. So a man named Darius, he was the king of the Medes, part of a partnership between him and a man named Cyrus the Persian. We'll see him at the very last verse of chapter 6. They're together, the Medes and the Persians, and they took over the Babylonians. They killed the Babylonians and now took over their kingdom. And Darius is in charge at 62. And right here I want to explain to you that Daniel is right now about 80 to 85 years old. He's not a child, he's not a young adult, not a young man. So Daniel in the lion's den is with a very old and wise He is Amidala. He's an old wise man. He was taken captive at about 13, 14, 15 years old at 605. Add roughly 70 years and you got close to 85-year-old man. Now, beginning in Daniel chapter 6. And as we go to Daniel chapter 6, I do want to get one level of application. We're going to see actually something that pertains to us here, and we're going to see actually something that pertains to Christ as well in this Passion Week. As it relates to us, I just want to ask you a question, because this is the question that comes out of Daniel chapter 6. The question is this, especially as we live in this time of uncertainty, coronavirus, and we're all isolated, and all that's happening now, but this will go away. We'll go to normality for a while, and another crisis will happen. That's how life is. But when it comes to what this passage will show us, I just ask you one question, which is if you had 24 hours left to live, that's what you had, whether it's a doctor that told you or God told you, whatever it is, you have 24 hours left to live, what would you do? What would be your next course of action? That answer will come directly out of this text, right here, this story of Daniel and the lion's den. So as we're reading, you start searching for where that answer is going to come, and I'm going to point it out to you about what you should think about doing if you know that you have a very short time left to live. But let's get into it right here with Daniel chapter 6. Following the text, I think we're just going to read the verses and I'll explain them a little bit, but this is so well written, I think it's going to go like an action-packed movie. Here we go. It seemed good to Darius to appoint 120 satraps over the kingdom, that they would be in charge of the whole kingdom, and over them 3 commissioners, of whom Daniel was one, that these satraps might be accountable to them, and that the king might not suffer loss. That's how it opens. First, we open with the king, Darius, appointing now some governors. They're called satraps. Darius is in charge. We saw that at the end of chapter 5. And the first thing you do is you set up your government. And here's what is just so fascinating. We just don't understand it. He appoints 120 satraps, governors, over the kingdom. That says he's got a pretty sizable kingdom. To have 120 ministers that are governing for you, they'd be in charge of the whole kingdom. And over them, 3 commissioners who are over the satraps. So 3 are over the 120. That means there's 123 total in management. And notice this in the brackets, of whom Daniel was one. Can you imagine? The king that goes in and kills the Babylonian king, and as he sets up his government, instead of having exactly 120 and the 3 already hand-picked, ready to go, so that when he takes over, he puts these men in place, someone gets fired, someone gets sacked, so that Daniel gets his position. And not only that, it's one of the top 3. Why would you take an 85-year-old Jewish slave and make him one of your top 3 governors? But yet there we see it. That these 3 satraps might be accountable to them, or all these satraps, these 120 satraps, might be accountable to these 3, and that the king might not suffer loss. Daniel was found, I guess, trustworthy enough that the king of the Medes would put Daniel over a big chunk of his kingdom. That says Daniel had a reputation, doesn't it? He had a huge reputation. He knew what Daniel was to Nebuchadnezzar. He had to have heard. He didn't just blindly do this. No king, no military king would do that unless he understood Daniel was better than anybody he had. Remember, the Babylonian king in chapter 2 found him to be 10 times better than anybody in his kingdom. I think that carried through, didn't it? This comes down to what I see as Proverbs chapter 22, verse 29. Do you see a man skilled in his work? He will stand before kings. He will not stand before obscure men. I think Daniel was the fulfillment of that. He understood that. So now we see this amazing thing that the king appoints 120 governors and 3 over the 120, and one of those 3 is Daniel. So verse 3, then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit. We've seen that in the last chapters. And the king planned to appoint him over the entire kingdom. So here in this time frame, the king even had organizational plans to put Daniel over the other 2. He was going to do that. Well, of course, we know what would happen there. Verse 4 tells us, then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel in regard to government affairs. I take my pen and underline that, in regard to government affairs. You see, that's how they were trying to trip him up in his job, how he did his work. So they were trying to find a ground of accusation, but they could not find. They found no ground of accusation or evidence of corruption, inasmuch as he was faithful, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Isn't that great, having a government here where a man is just committed to no corruption? Seems impossible, doesn't it? And he was a foreigner, a Jew, an enemy. But you know what other things that we understand is? When Daniel was with Nebuchadnezzar, he was in charge of all the magicians, the things that are opposed to God. And yet he was found faithful in administering his job. He would have been in charge of taxation, collecting taxes from his own Jewish people who were businessmen and maybe even some prosperous people who were out and about. And all the people there making money, he was in charge of collecting it all. No favoritism at all, even with his own people. He was in charge of slave labor. His own people were slaves, and he was in charge of administering slaves' rights and slaves' work duties and all of that. And you know what? He didn't cut any corners for his people. He was found faithful. He did his job. This means people who serve the living God can actually serve the governors that God has put them under. You're actually serving God when you serve your employer faithfully, even if you don't like what they're doing. Even if what they're doing doesn't honor God. As characters, they don't honor God, but you're just doing normal employment. Now, he didn't expect you to break God's law, and they were not expecting Daniel to break God's law. He was administering what the king had expected. So he was faithful. Verse 5, then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him with regard to the law of his God. They realized the only way we can get Daniel is to somehow trip him up in terms of his worship, because he does his job better than all of us. So we see a plot now being formed. The plot is formed from verses 6 to 9. The commissioners, they come by agreement to the king. They go, King Darius, live forever. All the commissioners of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the high officials and the governors, they've consulted together that the king should establish a statute, enforce an injunction that anyone who makes a petition to any god or man besides you, O king, for 30 days shall be cast in the lion's den. This sounds exactly like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego with that golden statue, doesn't it? They set up a rule that says everybody's got to worship this statue, and then they find the Jews who aren't doing it, and they go get them. It's exactly what happened with Nebuchadnezzar. Now it's happening again with Darius the Mede. Try to set laws up against worshiping God, and then you've got your enemies, you've got your Christians, you've got your Jews here, in this case Israel. So they said, we can do that. So they agreed that a petition would be that if anybody worships any other god other than you, O king, you throw them in the lion's den. Verse 8, so they said, now establish it and sign it according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which may not be revoked. So give it the double stamp. Give it the signature that you can't revoke it. Even you can't revoke it. Make it that strong, king. You're worthy of that kind of worship. Darius, here he is, actually planning to promote Daniel to be in charge of everything and everybody, but he doesn't notice out of 123 employees, only 122 are present, because Daniel's not there. Daniel's not there to give approval. The king, in his own ego, says, this is a great idea. He didn't turn and say, Daniel, what do you think? I'm about to promote you to be over everything. He didn't do that. Daniel wasn't there. The king's ego was stroked. And so he said, yeah, it's a great idea. So he did it. And he signed it. Verse 9, he signed the document. That is the injunction. Here it is, the answer to the question. Verse 10. Now, when Daniel knew that the document was signed, stop. You see that? When Daniel knew the document was signed, he knew he was going to die. When Daniel knew the document was signed, he knew he had 24 hours to live. He knew he was headed straight for the lion's den because it was the law of the Medes and the Persians, couldn't be revoked. He knew with absolute assurance that he was going to die. So what did Daniel do? What does the text tell us? It says, now, when he knew that the document was signed, he entered his house. Now in his roof chamber, he had windows open toward Jerusalem, and he continued kneeling on his knees 3 times a day, praying and giving thanks before his God as he had been doing previously. So that's our question. What do you do? What did Daniel do with 24 hours left to live? Well, I think we should get our windows and open them up toward Jerusalem. What do you think? Of course, it'll be a little colder in the wintertime. Should we do that? Should we open up our windows to Jerusalem? Or how about maybe we should just pray 3 times a day? We should just increase our prayer life. If we have 24 hours left to live, maybe we should pray more. But again, why would that make a difference if I know I'm going to die in 24 hours? Daniel didn't do anything like that. Yes, he prayed. Yes, he opened his windows, but that's not what the text really tells us. He did do that, but that's not what was unique. He was actually giving thanks, so should we be thankful? Yes, we should. We should do all those kinds of things, but that's not really what the text is saying. Look what it says. He was praying and giving thanks before his God, and notice the next phrase, as he had been doing previously, as he had done in previous times, as was his normal custom. You know what Daniel did when he knew he had 24 hours left to live? He did the same thing he did yesterday. He did exactly the same thing he did the day before. He made no change. And that's our lesson. You see, if every day you're doing what you should be doing, when your life is now threatened, don't do anything different. Do what you should be doing. Because you're doing the best, the most important thing you could be doing, right there. If your life's going to be taken, your life's going to be taken. Don't try to increase. If you want to increase something, do it now. And live that way. But Daniel lived a life of prayer and discipline every day of his life. So when he knew he was going to die, his discipline never changed. He just went about his business. You see, when you do that, you can live a life of no fear because you are doing everything you should be doing every single day. There is nothing absolutely to fear. You see no fear in Daniel's countenance here at 80 plus years old, as he had been doing previously. Well, we know what happened then. Verse 11, here come the men. They come out by agreement, find Daniel making petition, praying to his God. So they ran to the king in verse 12, and they said, wait a minute, king, didn't you sign an injunction so that any man who makes a petition or any god besides you, O king, for 30 days is to be cast in the lion's den? The king said, yeah, the statement's true. I did that according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which may not be revoked. So they answered and said to the king, aha. Remember Daniel, the guy that you thought was so good? He's the one of the exiles from Judah. Remember, one of the slaves? Somehow you thought he was good, but we found out different. We know how he's really against you, O king. He's one of the exiles from Judah, pays no attention to you, O king, or to the injunction which you signed, but keeps making his petition 3 times a day. You see, we've got you right there. Now you'd think the king would be angry like Nebuchadnezzar was. But this king wasn't. This king knew Daniel's value. He knew how Daniel would make him more money. He knew how Daniel would help him. And so verse 14 says, as soon as the king heard that statement, he was deeply distressed. Oh, he did everything he could to try to figure out how to change the law and do something. He set his mind on delivering Daniel even until sunset. He kept exerting himself to rescue him. And every time he kept trying to change something, verse 15 says, the men came by agreement to the king, said, according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, king. And then he would run over to another building, try to find a document that had a law that could do something, and he'd find a couple of guys who said, sorry, king, according to the law of the Medes and Persians. Daniel's headed to the lion's den, buddy. You can't change it. So verse 16 tells us, so the king gave orders, he was trapped. Daniel was brought in, cast into the lion's den. He brought this 80-plus-year-old man walking like Madala, just with his walking stick. He's just walking slowly. The king spoke and said to Daniel, your God, whom you constantly serve, will himself deliver you. Notice, again, very different than Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? Instead of him saying it, Daniel saying it, the king actually said it. Your God, whom you continuously serve. What did the king know about Daniel? He knew that he continuously served his God. Daniel had a testimony. You see, he was bearing fruit. He had a testimony. The king knew that and said, I know he will deliver you. Stone was brought and laid over the mouth of the den. And so the king sealed it with his own signet ring, with the signet rings of the nobles, so nothing could be changed. And then verse 18 has a very interesting statement here. He says, the king went off to his palace, spent the night fasting. No entertainment was brought before him, and his sleep fled from him. He couldn't sleep all night, and he had the king's quarters. Best room in the house. Couldn't sleep. No entertainment. Didn't want to eat. He could do nothing. Daniel, how did he sleep? Well, he went down there and saw a bunch of these big lions. They're just laying around. They're just kind of looking at him, and he's looking at them. Well, when you're 80 some odd years old, it's bedtime, you know. You got to do something, and that rock is cold. So he lays down. I'm sure he laid down on the right there and used one of them as a pillow. Just kind of laid down, and you could hear the purring of the cats. Like that. They're just kind of purring. Well, it's kind of warm. Nice vibrator. That's nice. Best sleep I've had all night. You know, all month. It's the best sleep I've ever had. The king, he can't sleep at all. Daniel is there with the lions. Well, as soon as we see that, the very next thing that happens in verse 19, the king rose at dawn, went in haste to the lion's den. He comes near to Daniel. He cries out with a troubled voice. He's afraid he's not going to hear anything. So he speaks and says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you constantly serve been able to deliver you from the lions? Here's this voice of an 80-year-old man. O king, live forever. My God sent his angels, shut the lions' mouths, they did not harm me, inasmuch as I was found innocent before him, and also toward you, O king, I've committed no crime. So Daniel said, you know what? If I should have been guilty of anything, God could have done something, but I can't think of anything, meaning you know I haven't done anything. I've just honored my God. Shut the lion's mouths, but he also kept the lion's paws from hurting Daniel too. Daniel was untouched, comfortable. So the king then was very pleased, verse 23, and gave orders for Daniel to be taken up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den. No injury whatever was found on him because he trusted in his God. And that's when the king now gets in. You can see the king's anger coming in now, verse 24. So the king now gave orders. Only his orders were for the men who trapped Daniel. And they brought those men who had maliciously accused Daniel, cast them, their children, and their wives into the lion's den, and they had not reached the bottom of the den before the lions overpowered them and crushed all their bones. You know what this means? This means actually the lions were hungry. So those people who said, well, the lions didn't eat Daniel because they'd already been overfed, and they just had already eaten, so they were kind of sleeping. No, the lions were very hungry. They had a feast. They overpowered all these people, these satraps. That's a lot of lions, because there was actually 122 of these people who got together to come after Daniel, and their wives and their kids. That says these lions there was a lot of them, and they were hungry. Daniel had no issue there, because God preserved him in the lion's den, but he had to be willing to go into the lion's den to start with. And so we see then, in verse 24, Daniel comes out, they go back in, they trade places, judgment. Many people think that's the end of the story of Daniel in the lion's den, but it's not. It's not the story of somebody goes in, and God brings an angel, and they come back out. That's a wonderful story. Oh no, that's just really the backdrop. The real story comes in verses 25 to 28. But 25 to 28 can't happen unless there's a man going into the lion's den. So what do we see here? Well, Darius is obviously impressed. Verse 25, then Darius the king wrote to all the peoples, nations, and men of every language who were living in all the land, may your peace abound. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. Boy, we've seen that, haven't we? Twice with Nebuchadnezzar. He just kept saying, you got to fear God, the God of Daniel. You got to fear Daniel's God. Nobody can worship any God other than Daniel's God after the king has gone through a big trial. Well, here, Darius the Mede now is saying exactly what Nebuchadnezzar had said. I make a decree that in all the dominion of my kingdom, men are to fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and enduring forever. And his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed, and his dominion will be forever. He delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders in heaven and on earth, who has also delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. And look at this last verse. So this Daniel enjoyed success in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Why are both of those men listed? Because remember, it's the Medes and the Persians. Two kingdoms together form an alliance, the Medes and the Persians. The Persians are a bit higher. The Persians are a bit stronger. Cyrus the Persian had a bigger investment in this relationship. The Medes were supportive. We're actually going to see this as we go to Daniel chapter 7. There's a prophecy that actually shows what I just said. But the Medes and the Persians came and they took the Babylonians, and Daniel succeeded in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And it's important that that note is there. Darius, we see in 25 and 26, he made a decree. It means he wrote something in a decree and sent it out to his entire realm, sent it to his whole dominion. Well, if he's a smart manager, if he's a smart king, he made sure he copied his boss. He would make sure his boss would get a copy of that decree that says, everybody better fear and tremble before the God of Daniel. He's living God. Kingdom will not be destroyed. Dominion will be forever. The key is that he delivers and rescues and performs signs and wonders. And he delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. The idea that Daniel was delivered from so many lions in the cave at his age was such a fact that it impressed the king so much. He wrote this in a decree, sent it out, and sent it to Cyrus. Well, why would I think he sent it to Cyrus? I'm going to show you. Okay, we've seen Daniel in the lion's den. How he made it. What did Daniel do with 24 hours left to live, knowing he was going to die? He did the same thing he did the day before, which means his life was in order. Remember that, Daniel chapter 1? He made up his mind to obey the law of Moses, the law regarding what Moses said about eating. He made up his mind. I'm going to live a life of discipline. I'm going to be skilled in what I do. I'm going to stand before kings. I've got nothing to be afraid of. I've got my integrity. I'm going to do everything I do every day. I don't change. So when my life is at risk, you know what I do? I do the same thing I did yesterday. And I can do that with integrity. I can do that with courage. And it means I've got no fear because I'm at my best. I'm at my peak in serving God. I'm doing the same thing every day. That's what Daniel did. God put him in the lion's den. But he put him in there for a reason. The reason is this. Because Darius wrote the decree. Now what do we know about this decree? Go to Ezra, the book of Ezra, chapter 1. Ezra chapter 1. Ezra is found back toward more in the Old Testament. It's right after Nehemiah and right before Esther. Oh, excuse me, it's right before Nehemiah. Right before Nehemiah. Right after 2nd Chronicles. You see this in Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. So if you're there, okay, you're there. It took me a little bit of time to find it as well. Ezra chapter 1, verse 1. Listen to these words. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Stop there for a second. What year are we in Daniel in the lion's den? We're in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia. How do I know that? Because Daniel chapter 5, Darius the Mede took over the kingdom, and he set up his kingdom there in Daniel chapter 6. Well, the Medes and the Persians are the ones together that are taking over, so this is Cyrus's first year. So in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, in order to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, so in other words, in order to fulfill prophecy by Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout all his kingdom, and also put it in writing, saying, Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he's appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may his God be with him. Let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and rebuild the house of the Lord, the God of Israel. He's the God who's in Jerusalem. How did God stir up the spirit of Cyrus to do something like this? I mean, he's got thousands and thousands of Jews as slaves. Slave labor. Making him rich. And he's going to take all of that slave labor out of Babylon and move it back to Jerusalem and pay for it, pay for the travel, and pay for them to rebuild the temple. The Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he sent a proclamation throughout everywhere in his kingdom. Whoever's a Jew that wants to go back to Jerusalem, you go back and rebuild the house of the Lord. How do you think Cyrus did that? How was his spirit stirred up? Well, I think he received a letter from his general, Darius the Mede, that said, you got to understand this. We do not mess around with this God. The letter from Darius, I think, had great influence on Cyrus to make this political decision. And what was the result of that political decision? All of Israel goes back to Jerusalem as promised by Jeremiah, who prophesied that 70 years you'll be in Babylon and then you'll leave. All this happened to do that. And in the first year of Jeremiah, or first year of Cyrus, that was about the 68th, 69th year, roughly. So they're getting ready to go now. What caused that prophecy to be fulfilled? A man going into the lion's den. Didn't just have courage, he had trust in his God to perform his God's will so that he could stand with courage, he could stand with conviction, he could be where he needed to be and trust in his God. This is just like our Savior, Jesus Christ. Set his face like flint to go to Jerusalem. You know what Jerusalem was? Jerusalem was the lion's den. Let me go to Jerusalem and die. Let's go there, right into the pit of vipers, and go there. And he went there to fulfill his Father's will so that we could have new life and be free. And not just the Jews, so that the Greeks, so that the Jews, and everybody in between would be free from sin, free from the power of sin, the penalty of sin, and we could be united with him forever. And it took him going to that cave of death to do that. Daniel was willing to go and be a man of integrity into the lion's den. God delivered him out, stirred up Darius to write the decree. Cyrus got it and said all of Israel is going back to Jerusalem. That's the way it's going to be. Fulfilling God's will in a major way for Israel. So the story of Daniel and lion's den is not just a Sunday school story, is it? It's a story of God's promise and faithfulness to get Israel out of judgment, really, out of their discipline of being in Babylon for 70 years and going back all the way to Jerusalem, paid for, first class, by Cyrus, because Daniel went into the lion's den. And then in a much greater way, Christ went into the den of vipers in Jerusalem, stayed there. They tried to kill him, but they could not because he resurrected. He gave up his life. They did not kill him. He gave up his spirit so that we would have life in a much greater way. So this is how Daniel shows us. It really shows Jesus coming into this week, which is really the lion's den coming in, and Israel getting delivered out of bondage. That's exactly where we are, in bondage, delivered out. So that's Daniel chapter 6 and how it ties to this week and Jesus in Monday going in and saying it's not just for Israel, it's for the Greeks. And it's not a worship of sacrifice. It's a worship of being united with me and believing in me. And so that's what we see in Daniel chapter 6 and on Monday of the first day of the Easter week. Tomorrow, we're going to be in Daniel chapter 7 as the prophecies begin, and we'll see what happens on Tuesday of that Easter week as well. Thank you.